Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Dr. Hannah Power, a big welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. Dr. Power is a senior lecturer and researcher at the University of Newcastle, focusing on waves, coastal systems, and the influence of water movement on marine and coastal environments. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Hannah, you grew up in Sydney, and when we were talking before, you mentioned that as a kid you've loved the beaches of the south coast of New South Wales. You learned to scuba dive on the Great Barrier Reef when you were a kid, and that these have been kind of major inspirations for you and your career path and your research. And it's quite funny how many of Australia's marine scientists have been inspired at a young age by their experiences of blue spaces. Is there any one place that really kind of set that spark for you?
Yeah, well, I guess there are a couple of places. So I was really lucky as a kid that I had holidays on the south coast of New South Wales. Almost every summer, reliably, we'd spend lots of time at the beach, lots of time in the water, lots of time, snorkeling, surfing, all of those kind of things. And so I've always been around the ocean. I always have felt really comfortable in and around the ocean. Swimming and being in the sea is one of those things that I find so enjoyable and so calming and restorative and so much a part of who I am. Yeah. And then it was also, so that's always been a part of my life. But then when I was a sort of young teenager, I was lucky enough to go on a holiday up to the Great Barrier Reef where I learned to scuba dive. And that was one of those moments where, I'd always been interested in science. I'd always liked sort of mathematical and scientific things. I'd always been really curious, but it was learning to dive on the Great Barrier Reef, which was that moment where I thought, I want to study this stuff. And it was, I really want to study coral reef systems. I really want to study the ecosystems, the organisms that form coral reefs, and so on. And so that was, as a young teenager, that was an idea that sort of got stuck in my head. And it stayed there so much that I enrolled in a marine science degree at university. And I got to second year and realized that it wasn't so much biology that really captured my attention, but it was the oceanography side of things that I really enjoyed. And so having that diversity in my degree meant that I was able to find something that I didn't even really know could be a career path. No one tells you when you're at high school, hey, you can study beaches for a living, So I was really lucky to kind of fall into that side of marine and coastal science.
And that's pretty cool that you mentioned as well about loving maths and these places and kind of the assumption that it would be, biology. But you can study beaches. I wish someone had told me that when I was at school as well. It's actually a job studying beaches.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. Your research and teaching, it's taken you all over the coastlines of Australia. You've worked in beaches, rocky coastlines, muddy coastlines, mangroves, coral reefs, underwater seascapes. I mean, that's a phenomenal range of habitats that this has taken you into. Is one of them your favourite?
Oh, I don't know that I could pick a favourite study site. I don't know. That might always be a bit like trying to pick a favourite child. Look, they're so diverse. There's the sort of rugged, rocky coastlines of the south coast of New South Wales. There's the beautiful, long beaches of northern New South Wales. I mean, how do you pick between a sort of rugged, rocky, sandy coastline on a stormy day and a coral reef looking shiny and sparkly on a sunny day? They've got different things that they offer, and they're all beautiful environments. And I love the diversity that you get along our coasts.
That's awesome. What does a day studying coasts and beaches look like for you?
So it varies so much, and it entirely depends on what project that I'm working on. So, like every other scientist, there are days that are entirely sat in front of a computer looking at data and crunching through numbers and trying to make figures that explain what we're trying to see. But when we're collecting data, a sort of typical day doing, for example, an experiment on how waves behave on beaches and how they move sand around and how they change after they break will involve typically getting up reasonably early, carrying lots of stuff down to the beach. Sometimes we're lucky and we have vehicle access to the beach and we can get our car onto the beach and get our gear down really easily. But often it involves carrying lots of bulky, heavy gear down to the beach, setting it up. Often we'll be putting equipment into the water. We work really strongly as teams. So there's a lot of, large equipment that we need to put into the water. It's about securing it down, making sure that it's safe, it's going to stay in position. And then oftentimes there's a bit of a lull in the middle of the day. We've got all our gear set up, it's all recording, it's all monitoring what we want it to be monitoring. And then during the middle of the day, often we're kind of just maintaining it, checking it, staying in position. We might be surveying the beach to see how the sand is moving around on the beach, how the beach is changing in its shape. And then often at the end of the day, it's the reverse process. It's get in the water again, pull all the gear out, pack it up, take it back to wherever it's staying and cleaning it all down so that nothing is left covered in a layer of salt and sand.
Nice. And that kind of research, it has some really important applied outcomes as well. Understanding water movement and what's happening to shores is really important, for example, in helping people enjoy those spaces and enjoy them safely. Like some of your research in intertidal rocky shelves can be really dangerous places for people to go to, but your work is helping people work out when it's safe to go there, right? You've worked with national parks to develop tools people can access?
Yeah, exactly. So I worked with colleagues in the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment recently to develop an online wave risk forecast tool for a site called the Figure Eight Pools in the Royal National Park south of Sydney. And this was a site that became social media famous. Yeah. And so it went from having, a few thousand visitors across an entire summer to having a few 100 visitors to 1,000 visitors in a weekend.
Wow.
And so it was this huge challenge for parks to manage because they had a real shift in the demographic of the visitor. They went from people who were out doing their hikes and who were used to being out and about and, had an understanding of natural systems and the sort of risks associated with them, to having international tourists who would fly into Sydney, do the Opera House on Monday, Bondi Beach on Tuesday, Figure Eight Pools on Wednesday. Wow. And so it was a completely different demographic. So I worked with colleagues in state government and also in parks to we did some monitoring to look at what sort of conditions, what sort of wave heights offshore and what sort of tide conditions drive these wave hazards onto the platform, because with that increase in visitor numbers, there was a huge increase in the number of injuries and incidents. And it's a remote site. It takes about an hour to walk in and an hour to walk out. There's no road access. So if you get injured down there, it's really, really problematic.
Yeah.
So we looked at what conditions drive the wave hazards and what sort of conditions we get the most problematic wave hazards. And we used all that information to develop a live tool that uses forecasts for waves and tides to tell you what the hazard rating is. So is it a high hazard? Is it a low hazard? And so you can look and get a 4-day forecast about when is going to be the best and safest time to go.
That's fantastic. It's a really good example of how understanding what's happening to coastal systems is important in how we use them, because people, they love to go there. You've also spent a great deal of your research on coral reefs.
I've done some work on coral reefs.
Close to my heart.
Absolutely, yeah. They're beautiful environments. I can entirely understand why you would want to be a coral reef scientist.
Yeah. And you're looking at the benefit of coral reefs in terms of providing coastal protection, right, for islands and atolls and coasts, how they interact with wave action. That's been some of the research you've done?
Yeah, so we've done some work looking at how waves behave after they break on coral reefs and how much having a coral reef in front of an island or a shoreline can protect that shoreline behind it, because obviously, coral reefs are really shallow, waves break on them. And so that process dissipates lots of the energy in the waves. And so by the time the waves get to the island shoreline that's behind the reef, they've got a lot less energy in them. And so the reef is actually providing a protective service to that island. And so one of the uncertainties associated with climate change and sea level rise is how will those protective services change? So will the coral continue to grow upwards with the sea level rise, and therefore the sort of protective service will be about the same? Will we see degradation to the reef that will result in more wave energy getting across that reef? Or will the sea level rise so fast that the coral reef can't keep up with it? And so we will also see more wave energy getting behind those reef systems. So there's still some uncertainties around some of that stuff. Yeah. But it's something of concern and something that we need to factor into when we're trying to manage our tropical shorelines.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know things like bleaching events, which is what I study, actually can really drive that loss of complexity of corals really quickly, because they die and they start to get eroded and they break down quite quickly. So for some places that's really important, that interaction between what's happening out at the edges of the reef and then what happens closer into shore.
So as you say, bleaching degrades the coral and often it ends up eroding. So that's another thing that can happen, is you may not necessarily actually have a net decrease in the level of the reef relative to the water level, but that loss of structural complexity can actually impact the waves, because the roughness, the structure within a coral reef can actually cause more wave energy to be dissipated. So if you lose that structural complexity, you can also lose some of the ability of a reef to dissipate wave energy.
How does that affect how we understand the impacts of climate change on places like coral reefs? Do we have really an answer as to whether the balance between sea level and climate change impacts how they're going to affect? Is it going to be kind of a uniform, or are all reefs going to be a little bit different in how they respond?
Yeah, so as you would be aware, different reefs have different structural complexities. Different reefs sit at different levels relative to the mean sea level. And so all of these things are going to have an impact. It's also going to matter whether the reefs are really wide, whether they're really narrow. All of those things are going to result in really individual effects on different reefs, and lots of variability in terms of what climate change impacts we see on those reefs in terms of the protective services that they provide to anything behind them.
Yeah. So water movement is really important for the biology of corals and the biology of reefs, and that's kind of an area where there's a bit of interest in, can we engineer our way out of problems through engineering water movement? And your research would probably be able to talk a lot about the difference between like internal water movement and surface water movement. What do you think are some of the challenges in maybe applying engineering approaches to manipulate water movement around reefs?
So yeah, there are lots of challenges in terms of manipulating water movement around reefs. One of the challenges is that anytime you work in a marine environment, it's always a really challenging environment. You see the impacts of being in the marine environment on structures that we have in the marine environment, on boats. It's a tough environment out there. The salt is really degrading. You have storms, all of these things. So it's just a really challenging environment to start with. It's also challenging in that, I don't know that we really have a great idea about how all the mass circulation happens, at different levels within, say, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park area. There are areas where you've got channels, you've got reefs that interrupt water flow. It's hugely complex. And so altering water flow around a couple of reefs to maybe, bring up some cooler water to cool down the reef to try to prevent bleaching events. Well, how is that going to affect the reefs that are downstream from that reef? Is that going to affect the ecological systems that are on the seafloor between the coral reefs? All of those things. There are often all these like flow-on implications that we don't necessarily think about when we think, oh, well, we'll do X to try to save this particular reef, but how is that going to affect everything else? Everything is so interconnected in a system like the reef.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there systems we can learn from in terms of making decisions or talking about engineered solutions in these kind of environments and marine environments? Are there places it's been particularly successful?
Yeah, look, I don't know that there are, and I probably would want to fact check this, but I don't know that there are any really good examples of where we've engineered really significant solutions to try to protect reefs.
Yeah. In other habitats, not just reefs though, where we've manipulated water movement or waves or anything.
Yeah, look, there are certainly examples where we've created sort of novel ecosystems to try to use natural systems as protective services, so replacing
Yep.
things that have been lost. So, for example, there was a recent article in the news, maybe in the last couple of months, about how in a few places around Boston Harbor in the United States, they've replaced, intertidal wetland systems that were lost through the development of the harbour.
Yeah.
And they've built these, sort of living defences to try to protect the developments that are behind them, rather than having sort of hard structures like seawalls and so on. And we know that other ecological systems provide really good protective services. So, for example, during the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, areas where mangroves were still intact along the coastlines had far fewer tsunami impacts than areas where the mangroves had been removed. So we know that these ecological systems provide protective services, but in a lot of places we've removed them, and that can have detrimental long-term effects.
Knowing all this about coastal erosion, tsunamis, wave action, does this influence where you choose to live or where you would think about living?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So there are things that I'm conscious of that are risks, like, for example, large earthquake-generated tsunami or submarine landslide-generated tsunami, but they're not such significant risks that they're not things I'm willing to tolerate. So, for example, I live right by the coast in Newcastle, and I'm comfortable living by the coast in Newcastle because I realise that a large tsunami, large earthquake-generated tsunami would be warned about in Australia, and the risk is very, very small. But for example, if I were buying property, I wouldn't be comfortable buying property that was built on sand, low-lying, immediately behind a beach, because I know that the likelihood of coastal erosion or coastal inundation is significant enough that it's a risk that I'm not willing to tolerate.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Nice. And that's where a lot of your research sits, isn't it? Is really understanding how water movement and waves interact with the coastline and the structures that are in place. One of the areas you've done a lot of work is beaches, and that's really topical in Australia at the moment with coastal erosion. Have we fallen in love with some of our coasts at one point in time and not really thought about how they're going to change in the decades to come?
Yeah, so a lot of the problems that we have along our coast in Australia are to do with the fact that the location of a beach changes through time. In calmer periods, waves will deliver more sand to the beach than they take away, and the beach builds outwards towards the ocean, and you get really nice, big, wide beaches. And then in storms, the waves tend to take sand offshore and put it into sandbars and so on offshore. And so the beach translates landward. So there's this constant back and forth. The system is constantly evolving and constantly moving around. But of course, every now and then you get a really, really big storm. And that means that the beach translates further landward than it may have done in the last 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years. And so in a lot of places around Australia, what we've essentially done is built on what would be considered the active beach zone over a very long time scale. And we talk about things like a return interval or an annual exceedance probability. And people will have heard about, this is a 1 in 10 year flood event or a 1 in 20 year flood event, which means that on average, a 1 in 20 year flood event will occur on average once every 20 years. Or alternatively, you could say there's a 1 in 20 chance of that event occurring in a given calendar year. So that doesn't mean that if you had one last year, you're waiting 19 years for the next one. It means that there's still another 1 in 20 chance of that happening this year. Now, because we, haven't been building structures along the Australian coastline for all that long, we've got sort of 200 years of building very fixed structures on the Australian coastline, 250 say, we don't have a very long record of how much our coastal zone has fluctuated. And so what we've done is we've built properties and we've built fixed infrastructure that has a relatively long lifespan, so maybe 50, 70 years, on areas of our coastline that would be within the active beach zone on maybe a 1 in 20 or 1 in 40 year timescale. And that combined with sea level rise, we're starting to see the effects of that, where we're having erosion into areas where we've put permanent infrastructure, and that's causing a lot of problems at the moment.
With sea level rise, are there places that you can or the research can identify which are most at risk sooner in that process, considering those risk factors?
Yeah, so we can, and there are certain areas where we see that the shoreline is likely to translate further landwards than in other areas, and that depends on a whole bunch of different characteristics of that part of the coastline. So it might be, how big are the dunes, how high are the dunes, how much sand is in the dunes, because we can think of the dunes a little bit like a savings account. When times get tough, you dip into your savings account. Yeah. And when times get tough on the beach, the waves dip into the dune and pull sand out of the dune system. And then during calmer periods, those dunes build back up again. Yeah. So if you've got a really big dune system with lots and lots of sand in it, there's more of a buffer there to protect any environments behind it. So areas with smaller dunes tend to be more prone to a loss of, or the shoreline translating further landwards. But then there are all sorts of other factors. So for example, whether or not you've got rocky reefs offshore, all of those kind of things play a role. So again, it's very, very site specific. But for example, in New South Wales, we see that coastal erosion is one of these things that ends up in the news a lot. It ends up on the front pages of newspapers, it's on the radio, on TV, and so on. But if we compare our exposure, so how many properties we might think are potentially at risk and how much infrastructure is at risk, say out to 2050 or 2100 on our open coast, it's actually about 1/10 of what is exposed around our estuaries due to sea level rise. And so it's actually our estuaries that are our really high risk areas. So, we've got about 10 times as many properties at risk of being inundated around estuaries at high tide and storm tide levels than we have houses on the open coast being affected by coastal erosion.
Nice. That's really interesting because, and what you were saying as well about the benefit that those, estuary environments have with the natural infrastructure of mangroves and things like that. These are often things that we are taking away as we build up those estuary habitats.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that often happens around estuaries is because they don't typically have very big waves. On our open coast, we're used to seeing storm waves. We're used to seeing large waves impacting the beach. So we don't build very close to the waterline. Whereas on estuaries, we don't have that. And so people have built infrastructure and, houses and roads and all sorts of stuff really, really close to the high tide level. So it doesn't take a lot of sea level rise. It doesn't take a very big storm surge for those properties to be impacted because there's much less of a buffer in those systems.
Often when we talk about modelling things into the future and understanding what's coming, there's an assumption that science and engineering can fix it. How much are we relying on engineering against water, waves, wave action, natural processes to get us out of these problems?
To some extent, we are. And I think to some extent, we're going to have some conversations around relocating some things because we can't keep everything where it is. It's just there's so much infrastructure ultimately that will be at risk. And so they're going to be some really difficult conversations that we need to have. There are certainly engineering solutions that can be done. I mean, the Netherlands is a classic example. How many people live below sea level in the Netherlands? But they've got a huge history of coastal engineering. They've got centuries of expertise in coastal engineering, and the community as a whole is used to the coast being an engineered thing. In Australia, we don't tend to have that idea that the coast can be an engineered thing. We want a natural beach. We want a beach that's covered in sand. Often we want the beach to be backed by trees. We want a really natural system. And so that's a real cultural difference between, say, Australia and the Netherlands. And so bringing people around to the idea of engineered solutions to protect infrastructure can be really challenging. But of course, there are pros and cons to every solution. There are going to be pros and cons to managed retreat or planned retreat, but there are also going to be pros and cons to strategies like hold the line, where you try to maintain the shoreline where it is. So everything is going to need to be weighed up, and the community is going to have to be part of all these decisions. And they're going to be difficult decisions and difficult conversations.
That social value is a really important point, because a lot of what we've been talking about in this podcast is how important blue spaces and marine spaces are to people. How many people now are interacting with these places, whether it's through surfing or going to the beach, or just the interest of their kids in these places. It's like you say, it's part of our identity, is that we're a beach country, we're a coastal
Absolutely.
country. So that societal changes would be a very big one, to embrace a very different look to our coast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hugely challenging. Australia identifies as a coastal nation. I think something like 80% of people in Australia live within 50 kilometres of the coastline. We often have this idea that we're a sort of outback, lots of space kind of people, but actually we're not. We live in metropolitan cities and we live on the fringes of our country. And, the idea of a summer beach holiday is such a seriously, it's a concept that is so well embedded in our national identity. And, I think the summer that we've just had, 2019-20, with the bushfires, where, in Victoria and New South Wales, so many people's summer holidays were so heavily impacted by the bushfire season. People were evacuated from their holidays.
Yeah.
I was evacuated. It's a real shift, and that was a real I think it was a real wake up call for a lot of people, that maybe things are not actually going to be how they've been before, and that we've taken this for granted somewhat.
Yeah, and that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition in time as well. If we're already seeing coastal erosion impacting our fringe living on the water's edge, and societies change slowly, what's coming in the next few decades? How much time do we have to make that choice in different places as to whether we become more engineered or whether we retreat? Do we have a lot of time to make that decision?
Well, I think as the events of the last few weeks have shown us, in some places the decision needs to be made now.
Yep.
We've just had a big East Coast low. There's another East Coast low forecast for this coming week at the time of recording. And that has the potential to have some serious impacts for some infrastructure along our coastline. So in some places, the decision is exceptionally urgent. In other places, there is more time. But as with anything, the sooner you plan and the sooner you get strategies in place, the better you're going to be in the long run.
Yeah. Some of your research has looked at sea levels of the past and what our coastlines have looked like over really long time spans. Does that help you and the people who do the kind of research that you do to inform those decisions about how do you prepare for the future, if we know how different our coastlines have been when sea levels have been really different?
Yeah, look, it absolutely can. We've seen sea level rise in the past. 18,000 years ago, sea level was 120 metres lower than it is today. Off the coast of New South Wales, the shoreline, if you're standing on a beach today, 18,000 years ago, the shoreline would have been between 20 and 50 kilometres further east of you. So this nation has seen sea level rise. The Indigenous people witnessed it, and they have oral histories describing the sea level rise. And so that can inform what we're seeing. But the difference of what's happening today is that sea level is rising so much more rapidly than it has in the past. And so it's a very different situation in that space.
I think that's a really nice point, because when we hear about sea level rise, it sounds like small. Like, it doesn't sound like that much, in how it's measured. But in the impact it has to things like waves and water movements, that's fast and a lot.
Yeah, and it's huge. And I think the thing that we often don't necessarily get across particularly well, or people struggle to understand, is that 1 metre of sea level rise doesn't mean the shoreline translates 1 metre landwards. In a lot of areas, our coastal regions are very, very flat. So 1 meter of sea level rise might actually mean the shoreline translates 100 meters landward or 150 meters or even 200 meters landwards. So it's not a direct correlation between the amount of sea level rise and the amount of shoreline movement. And that's very challenging to get across sometimes.
Yeah, particularly when, like you say, we're coastal dwellers, we live at the fringe, and that's a long movement inland.
It's huge, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Hannah, the other area of research that you have done a lot of work in is tsunamis and how we can predict and prepare for changes in our underwater seascape that happen quite dramatically, and what are the consequences to our coastlines. Can you tell us a bit more about tsunami risk for Australia and how can we prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. So Australia is relatively lucky. We have a relatively low tsunami risk compared to other countries around the world. Globally, about 3/4 of the tsunami that we see are generated by underwater earthquakes, where the crust of the earth shifts. It shifts the water above it, and then a wave radiates outwards from there. So Australia sits in the middle of a tectonic plate. And so those tectonic plate boundaries, when those tsunami generating earthquakes occur, are relatively far away from our coast. So, for example, the nearest places to us on the east coast are the plate boundaries to the north and south of New Zealand. On the northwest coast, we're exposed to the plate boundaries that run along the Indonesian archipelago. So that's one of the risks, and that is a risk. We saw some impacts from the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami here in Australia. So that was generated on that plate tectonic boundary that runs along Indonesia. We saw some relatively minor impacts from the 2011 Tohoku tsunami that had a huge impact on Japan. And back in 1960, there was a huge earthquake off the coast of Chile. And that was recorded at the tide gauge in Sydney Harbour as having waves of over 80 centimetres within Sydney Harbour. So that's a really sizable wave to have made it all the way across the Pacific Ocean. So earthquake-generated tsunamis, as I said, represent about 3/4 of the tsunami that we see around the world. More locally, however, there's a risk to Australia from tsunami generated by underwater landslides. And we're talking about really, really big landslides. So they might be sort of blocks of sediment that might be, say, 5 by 5 kilometres in dimension and, say, 200 metres thick. This sediment is being shed off our continental slope in depths between 500 and 1,200 metres, say, and this material is moving down slope. And as it moves, it generates a wave that can radiate outwards. So now the difference between the impacts of those types of tsunamis and earthquake-generated tsunamis for Australia is that the process that generates the tsunami is much, much closer to our shorelines. And so the time difference between when the tsunami is generated and when it reaches our coast is much less. So for the east coast of Australia, as I said, the closest tsunamigenic subduction zones are to the north and south of New Zealand. We'd get about a 1.5 to 2 hour warning. And, we have systems in place that monitor for earthquakes. They look at where the earthquake has occurred, how big it is, how deep it is, and assess whether or not there's a tsunami risk. And if there is, we have a system in Australia that will provide an alert if there is a tsunami risk for earthquake-generated tsunami. For submarine landslide-generated tsunami, however, we don't have a system in place. And so there is a residual risk there. The anticipated time between when the submarine landslide would occur and the tsunami wave hitting the coast is of the order of 15 to 20 minutes. So we're talking about something really close by that could have really significant but relatively localized impacts. We would expect typically maybe depending on the size of the tsunami, between 50 and sort of 200 to 250 kilometres of coast would be affected. So they're much more localized impacts rather than the earthquake-generated tsunami, which tend to have much larger impacts in terms of scale.
Yeah. And what does those kind of waves look like? Are they two different kinds of waves that are created?
Yeah, so the tsunami waves that we would see will look really, really different from the waves that we see every day on the coastline. So the waves we see every day along our coasts, might have wave periods of somewhere between 5 and 15 seconds. So every 5 to 15 seconds, you get another wave. The wave period for a tsunami wave varies from something like 10 minutes up to half an hour. So rather than the water coming up and going back every 5 to 15 seconds, it's coming up for half an hour and then it's going back for half an hour. Now, depending on the way the tsunami is generated, sometimes you see the water draw down. So you would see the shoreline recede. It would look like the tide was going out really, really rapidly. If you see that, that's a really bad sign. Go to high ground. Sometimes that won't happen though, and the tsunami, the crest of the wave will come in first. So, in terms of tsunami safety, heed any warnings that you were given. If you get an alert to your phone from your state emergency service that says there's a tsunami alert out, you need to go to high ground. Go to high ground. Don't go down to the beach to watch. And then what we think is a likely trigger for the submarine landslide tsunami, so the ones where we won't get a warning necessarily, we think the most likely trigger for those is a localized earthquake. So if you're at the beach and you feel a really big earthquake, again, go to high ground. That's the best advice we can give for those.
Yeah. And again, this is really applied use of your research, is understanding how the water responds and developing systems that can help protect people and warn people and educate them about what these wave movements do along our coastline, whether they're big waves or small waves.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things that I find so rewarding about my job, is that I can try and solve these really interesting science problems, but actually do something where I can really immediately see this is going to have an impact on people's lives. It's going to have an impact on whether or not we keep people safe. And that's an exceptionally rewarding part of my job.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. And I'm sure that there's kids out there who are studying, particularly those who love maths, but who also love the natural environment. I mean, what kind of skills do young people need to develop to try and follow this path that you've taken?
I think one of the most critical skills in terms of becoming a coastal geoscientist like me is actually observational skills. Going down to the beach, look at what's there, look at how it was different to yesterday or different to last week when you went. Look at how do the waves look different? Are they bigger? Are they smaller? Are the crests of the waves closer together? Are they further apart? All of these things are really, really critical skills. And, they're skills that are really, easy to develop. It's just practice. It's going down and looking and seeing how the environment is changing and trying to make links between, yesterday I came down to the beach and the waves were small and they were quite a long way apart and the beach was very flat. And then today I've come down to the beach and the waves are bigger and the beach is looking, the shoreline is further landwards and, there's been some erosion. I can see evidence of recent erosion. So, and starting to put those links together in your head. How does the water movement affect the environment that I'm looking at? I think they're the really sort of, they're the easy skills to start to practice.
That's fantastic. Before you say do the sign off, I just want to ask out of interest, is there any citizen science programs that you run or that you're involved in that people who are interested can get involved?
I don't run any, but there's a citizen science program called CoastSnap, which has set up, and it's a joint project between the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment and the Water Research Laboratory at UNSW. And they've set up metal mounts where you can put your phone in, you can take a photo of the beach and you can upload it to social media. And they do some science trickery in the background and they're able to look at how the shoreline has moved based on all the different photos that people upload and send in. And so we're able to get information about how beaches change just from people taking photos of the beach.
Nice. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Hannah. It has been really interesting to hear about all your work and absolutely amazing to hear about all the different systems that you work in. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Tracy.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.